Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here to talk about this book, which would not exist without the staff and the resources at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. I had a student that came into my office many years ago with a Xerox of an article about wrongly condemned man sentenced to death. And he was like, "You got to read this thing." And I read it and started collecting a little bit of information on it. And as I got interested in it, the first person that I called was Norwood Kerr here at the archives, and Norwood was able to retrieve probably 3,000 or 4,000 pages of trial transcripts, which formed the basis of the research for this book. So my debt of gratitude to the staff. Meredith McDonough helped me with the photographic selection, and as a former student, I certainly appreciate her. But like I mentioned, this is very much an Alabama Department of Archives and History book, and it is the story of this young man, Caliph Washington, who in 1957 was 17 years old. He lied about his age, joined the Army, and was back on leave in the summer of 1957, and was there visiting his parents. This is a Jim Crow story. This is a story that touches people throughout Alabama society. And it's very remarkable because most people have not heard of Caliph Washington. It's also very rare for a young African-American man who was barely literate, lived in extreme poverty in one of the worst places in Alabama for African-Americans to live, and that was Bessemer, Alabama. And for someone for an young African-American man to leave such a long paper trail is remarkable in and of itself. And it's his story. Robert Penn Warren, in his book, All the King's Men, years ago, and it came out in 1946, wrote a very interesting passage about a spider web and how that even the smallest touch on the spider web, just a slight murmur, a slight touch, would send shockwaves vibrating throughout the spider web. The spider would awaken because it felt those vibrations, and it would pounce on whatever had made the prey, whoever had caused that ripple. And that is so analogous to dealing with Jim Crow society in Alabama and throughout the South during this time period in the 1950s. What I realized in working on this project was the fact that there had been very little done on actually how Jim Crow operated in the legal system in Alabama from the bottom up. We think about the history, the historiography of the civil rights movement, and you think, well, boy, there's a really rich literature on the legal history of civil rights. But so much of that is very much top down in terms of what the Supreme Court is doing. This is truly a bottom-up history, looking at the struggles a young African-American male faced in 1957 from the moment he was accused of committing a crime, how the law enforcement dealt with him, how white law enforcement in Alabama dealt with him as a young black man, his arrest, his arraignment, all right, his trial, all right, his conviction, his sentencing. Okay, all of this tells us about Jim Crow society and how the Jim Crow legal system worked in Alabama. And it's really remarkable because from the beginning and the end, and there's a reason I put saga in the title of the book, because it truly is, it's a saga. This is a difficult history. It's a difficult history not only to write, but it's a difficult history to talk about and to even comprehend that the layers of injustice, okay, are so deep in Alabama that Caliph Washington just had no way out. It was almost a preordained conclusion that he was going to be convicted and ultimately sentenced to death. Well, in July 1957, as I mentioned, he was home on leave, and he went out on a double date with a friend, two girls from Inslee. And they went out on a double date and did stuff that most teenage kids do in the late 1950s. They went to an ice cream shop. They had no particular place to go. They went visiting folks, and they dropped the girls off late in the evening, somewhere between 11 and midnight. And Caliph went back to his friend's house, and they chatted for a few minutes. And Caliph decided that it was time to go home, and he begins driving. He's just outside. He's in Birmingham. He's on the western border, where a small municipality called Lipscomb is kind of wedged in between the western reaches of Birmingham and Bessemer, Alabama. And Caliph has to drive through Lipscomb to get to his parents' house in Bessemer. And so if you look up at the very top right of the screen, I've highlighted for you, that's basically the border line between Bessemer and Lipscomb. Okay, and like I said, Birmingham's going to be up farther to the right. And this is a map of Bessemer right around the time period in 1957 that this is occurring. So Caliph is coming back. He's on the South Bessemer Road, which turns into Dartmouth Avenue, and that's what's highlighted for you. And just as he is crossing the Bessemer city limits, a car appears behind him with bright lights on and starts riding his tail. He's concerned. He doesn't know exactly who's doing this, but this is the South in 1957. He's a young black man, and he is concerned that these are night riders or Klansmen that are up to no good and have the potential for violence. He begins speeding up, and the car matches its speed. He has his windows down. It's summer of 1957 in Alabama. And as he's driving along, he starts hearing sound of phew going by his window. And he realizes whoever is behind him is shooting bullets at him, shooting a gun off. So he speeds up even more. And here's the route he takes. He goes all the way down into Bessemer, and that rectangle box down there below the M is where he's going to drive around and around and around for several minutes as this car chases him. He doesn't know who it is or what's happening. At the very end, he looks up, and whoever's driving the car has turned on lights. It's a police officer who never turned on his siren, a police officer who had never turned on his lights to tell Caliph Washington who it was. Caliph pulls to an immediate stop, and he ends up on this dirt road in Bessemer. Now, Bessemer was a very segregated town. And unlike Birmingham during the Civil Rights era was roughly 60% white. Bessemer during the same time period is roughly 80% black, okay? But whites still hold the power in Bessemer. And if you look at these, I know the detail's not great on the map. So how do you engage in racial segregation housing practices in a town that's 80% black. Okay, in Bessemer, it was enforced in a very interesting way. All right, so on the main streets out here, on the squares of the city blocks, okay, is where the white people lived. But in the middle of these blocks were these dirt roads, okay, that were essentially alleys. And on the back of these alleys, you see this is where the African Americans lived, okay? They actually live in fairly close proximity to a lot of the whites. They're on the same block, but they're isolated in these very poor areas. It was estimated, even into the early 1950s, that 75% of all African Americans in the city of Bessemer had no indoor plumbing. There was no public housing projects in Bessemer at the time. So African Americans were living in these old shotgun shacks, okay, in very substandard housing. And this is where, on this dirt street, is where Caliph comes to a halt with his car, okay, and this is a scene from the next day. And the police officer, that's his patrol car that's still sitting there. What happens next is something that will be debated in court for the next 2 decades. Caliph, the police officer, gets out of his car, and it's probably between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning. He stomps back, and Caliph rolls down his window, and the police officer says, "Boy, where is that whiskey?" And Caliph is completely confused. And he says, in a very respectful way, "I don't have any whiskey. I don't know what you're talking about." What Caliph didn't know was a stakeout was going on right at the Bessemer-Lipscomb border. One thing is, and I think, Meredith, a lot of the photographs that you're putting up for the Alabama media group, I noticed several things. You've got a lot of people busting up moonshine stills in 1957. Okay, so illegal liquor trafficking had reemerged as a major problem in this Bessemer area in the late 1950s, and the police chief of Lipscomb, who was a Klansman by the name of Thurman Avery, and his deputy, James Cowboy Clark, went by Cowboy, were on a stakeout hoping to apprehend a demon rum whiskey runner that was there. And for whatever reason, Cowboy Clark decided to start chasing Caliph's car. There's no evidence. We don't really understand what was in his mind, what he saw, to think that Caliph was running whiskey, which of course he wasn't. It was probably too dark for it to even be racial profiling, because there weren't any street lights on these roads at the time. But at any rate, they end up back in this alley, and with Clark wanting to know where the whiskey is located. And Caliph continues to say he doesn't know. Clark asks Caliph to get out of his car, to put his hands over his head, and he's going to arrest him. He asks him to walk around on the other side of the car, other side of his police cruiser. He's going to ask him to get in, but before he does, apparently Clark pulls out his pistol and decides that he is going to pistol whip Caliph. That he's got his gun by the barrel, and he's going to come down with the butt of the gun on his head. Caliph knew exactly how this felt. Bessemer police years ago had given him a skull fracture, okay, by pistol whipping him, and he was not going to let that happen again. When Clark, who's about 6'4", Caliph is about 5'7", 5'8". As Clark starts to come down, Caliph reaches up and tries to stop him. A black man defending himself against the brutality of a white police officer. Cowboy Clark had his finger in the trigger, so that when Caliph put up and that gun came down on his hand, it discharged. And the cop was dead. All right, the bullet had sliced his aorta, and he was dead in just a few minutes. All right, and again, these are scenes from the next day, Clark kind of crumples to his knees. He's close to, the car door is still open here on this front side. And he's able to reach over, and you can see, if you look real closely, you can see a microphone sitting on the bench there on the front seat. He reaches that, he's still alive, and cries into the microphone, "I'm shot in the stomach," and he groans, all right? He couldn't identify where exactly he was. He was a police officer in Lipscomb. He had chased his suspect into Bessemer. So it took quite a while for Bessemer police officers to figure out exactly where Cowboy Clark was located. All right, and it was back up this alley, and it took about 10 or 15 minutes for them to locate him. Caliph Washington was stunned, and he understood very clearly the implication. He had just touched the spider web, and it was no slight ripple that would go out to the currents, go out to the corners of Alabama society. He had apparently committed a crime that, even though he had dared defend himself, against the brutality of a white police officer, he understood very clearly what the implications were. All right, he was a black man, who would be accused of murdering a white police officer, one of the two worst crimes that a black man could be accused of committing during this time, during the Civil Rights era, during this era of Jim Crow, and it was up there with being accused of raping a white woman. All right, a black man accused of killing a white police officer, a black man accused of raping a white woman, whether they're innocent or not, would send those ripples all across Southern society, Alabama society, and it would lead that sleeping spider, to pounce. And this is where the saga, that will last over the next 2 decades, this is where it begins. He has the gun. Caliph has the gun in his hands, because when Clark was shot, he just lets go and crumples to the ground. Caliph, who's very nervous, he understands. Someone in one of those houses here had come out on the front porch or was yelling out the bedroom window and had seen, or at least heard, what was going on, and then could see out his window what was happening. And someone yelled, "Boy, you need to get out of here because these white folks will kill you." And he took off, and he disappeared in the night. Investigators showed up, and you can still, they're looking at the car's been moved now, and they're looking at some of the blood that's on the dirt road. And so not only do Bessemer police officers show up, Lipscomb police officers, Jefferson County sheriff's deputies from that part of the county, Alabama state troopers, FBI, military officials, were all going to converge on that alley during the night and the next day. The man that lay dead was Cowboy Clark. Clark had no formal training as a police officer. In fact, his job just before becoming a police officer, he was a gas station attendant at a Gulf gas station on the Bessemer Superhighway that my uncle was the manager of. So Cowboy Clark worked for my uncle. And I remember having a conversation with him, and I said, well, what did he do? Was he a mechanic? And my uncle just laughed. And he said, no. Back then, we had service station attendants. Okay, he pumped the gas and cleaned the windows. He was Gomer Pyle and working at this gas station. And so if you pretty much owned a gun, were white, and could at least string together a few sentences, then you could get hired as a police officer, especially in a municipality like Lipscomb. The next day, on the front cover of the Birmingham Post-Herald and then the Evening Birmingham News, where there was a heart-tugging story about the death of this white police officer, about his widow, about his orphaned children. That was left. Caliph Washington was the prime suspect, and no one knew what happened to him. But this was Bessemer, Alabama, and Bessemer was a brutal place in terms of enforcing Jim Crow. With a majority black population, enforcing Jim Crow was incredibly violent. Klansmen and police officers were one and the same. And this is on the Bessemer Superhighway, coming into Bessemer from Birmingham, Fairfield, Midfield, Brighton, Roosevelt City, Brownsville, and into Bessemer. And you were welcomed to Bessemer by the Bessemer, Ku Klux Klan. Why are there 4 Ks, instead of 3? Because it's, I suppose it's the fact that it's the Ku Klux Klan, and it's the Bessemer number 20 Clavern. I assume it's Ku Klux Klan Clavern is the reason there's 4 Ks. But this should tell you something. This is at the entrance of Bessemer. This is on Bessemer city limits, out on the Bessemer Superhighway. One of the most active Klan chapters is here. One of the most violent Klan chapters. If you go and start looking at members of the Bessemer Klan, you will find them involved in many of the most outrageous acts of violence from the late 1940s through the 1960s. All right, members of the Bessemer Klan was responsible for a murder of a white civil rights worker in Selma in 1965, and the FBI reported that every older member of the Bessemer police force were members of the Klan. All right, so you've got the Klan and the Bessemer police Bessemer police force being one and the same, and they're investigating this crime. They're looking for Caliph Washington. Where did he disappear to? And here are a group of some Bessemer police officers and sheriff's deputies from the Bessemer cutoff region of Jefferson County. And the person on the left, who was a Klansman and was one, here he is with his pipe, was said to have been the police officer who shot and killed more individuals in the line of duty in Alabama history. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that this officer had a reputation. His name was Lawton Grinds, and but most people called him by his nickname, which was Stud. And my grandmother my parents grew up in Bessemer, and my grandmother used to threaten, my dad had 2 brothers, 3 brothers, and so they were always up to no good. My grandmother used to threaten them, okay, to get them to behave. You guys better watch it. You know, your dad's at work, but I can call and get Stud over here, and he will set you straight. My dad remembered that, you know, decades later about this guy. He was a Bessemer detective, and he would be leading the investigation for the crime. And of course, all evidence points to Caliph Washington. All right. And so back on that alley on that night, Caliph disappeared, ran through the night, hid in some woods near the Winona Mines in western Birmingham, got some help the next day, and was able to get smuggled out to the other side of Jefferson County in a small municipality named Adamsville, where he had a cousin. And his cousin had decided, we got to get this boy out of the state. All right, so under the guise of a fishing trip to Mississippi, all right, they're going to, 4 elderly African-American men are going to load an old Studebaker up with fishing rods and tackle boxes, and they're going to put Caliph Washington in there with them under the guise of, hey, we're going over to Mississippi to start fishing, okay? And they begin to smuggle him out of the state. This is Sunday morning. The crime occurred late Friday night, early Saturday morning, and Caliph has been on the run since then. And the level of brutality that the Bessemer Police Department are showing is absolutely mind-boggling. They just completely ignore jurisdictions. They ignore basic rights. One of Caliph's attorneys is later going to say that they bullied and beat every person that ever knew Caliph Washington. All right, a slight exaggeration, but certainly they bullied plenty of people. Miles outside of their jurisdiction, they would, without warrants, they would bust into houses, okay, beat people, and so Caliph and the guys start heading to Mississippi. Not long afterwards, Bessemer police officers show up in Adamsville. They bust into his cousin's house. They take a rifle and headbutt an 81-year-old woman, African-American woman, and she dies from her injuries. A young man that was in one of the houses they bust in, some natural reaction. You got people busting into your house, he's heading out the back door, all right? But these were white police officers, and this was a black man, and they were looking for a black suspect, and they shot and killed him, okay? All right, and it was later ruled justifiable homicide. So Caliph ends up on this trip and ends up in Mississippi on a Greyhound bus heading towards Memphis when after the Bessemer police had engaged in their sadistic romp through Adamsville, they were able to piece together the story that Caliph was on this bus to Memphis, okay, and Mississippi state troopers caught up with him, pulled him off the bus, and find a paper sack with Cowboy Clark's nickel-plated .38 special in it. Caliph took the gun with him, which just implicated him in terms of the crime. He was absolutely at the very, throughout the investigation, this is how Jim Crow justice worked. He was presumed guilty from the moment that Cowboy Clark died in that road. All right, and he is treated, I think, somewhat like a caged animal. All right, because he is arrested, he's taken back to a Mississippi State Trooper substation, and here come all the Bessemer police officers, people from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, and they bring with them a Birmingham News photographer, all right, who is going to snap all of these photographs of young Caliph Washington just after his arrest. And you see the Mississippi State Troopers in the background. And to me, this is one of the most intimidating photographs. All right, I have no idea who these men are. Don't think they're on the Bessemer police force. Caliph is later going to claim in court that they attempted to lynch him. And it obviously didn't happen. But here I think this is representative of the lack of justice he is going to face during this time period, with these angry white men surrounding him, and Caliph looking forlorn. And here you see Stud Grimes bumping shoulders with him, and then communicating with him with his ever-present pipe. All right, Stud was once reprimanded by his superiors for getting his photograph. They didn't know who it was necessarily, but he got his photograph in the Birmingham News, okay, at a Klan rally. And his pot belly and sheriff's, the robe wasn't closed all the way, and you could see underneath it, it was somebody in the Bessemer Police Department that was wearing the robe, and they figured out it was him. So Caliph is placed in a car, and in the evening he is brought back to Bessemer. Okay, this is very late that Sunday evening, causing quite a stir. And here he is led to jail by Bessemer's two leading law enforcement officials. Okay, on your left is Clyde Morris. He is the chief deputy sheriff of Jefferson County. On your right is George Barron, who for decades, into the 1980s, was police chief of Bessemer, Alabama. Okay, he is placed in jail. He has had no sleep. He is taken, fingerprinted, has his mugshot, and he's put in a library room where he is essentially forced to confess to the crime, to sign a confession. He was barely literate. He didn't understand what was going on. Over the next few weeks, a grand jury is going to indict him. He will be initially represented by two African American lawyers. On the left is David Hood. Make sure I got it right on your left. All right. Okay. David Hood, who was at Bessemer, Alabama's only African American lawyer, and Orzel Billingsley, who was Birmingham, one of the most dynamic lawyers in the African American community in Birmingham. They're going to represent him. But remember, this is how Jim Crow operates, all right? So you've got a crime, a Jim Crow crime that's been committed in a Jim Crow town, and suddenly he has been arrested. He's placed in front of this judge, okay, who's a white judge, and the African American attorneys won't defend him in court. Okay, it's not that they don't want to, but the way Jim Crow justice operates, it would have been considered uppity for a black man to have a black lawyer in court in front of a white judge and 12 white jurors. Okay, so he ends up with a court-appointed attorney, and the guilty verdict is a given. All right, they portray him as a cold-blooded killer, and he is convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to Alabama's electric chair. All right. Anybody that does Southern history knows that Southern historians love irony. This is Florence Clark. This is Cowboy Clark's widow. She holds a life insurance policy for Cowboy Clark. And Cowboy had taken it out a few weeks earlier. And this is one of those heart-tugging photographs just after his murder. You see her sitting on the bed. She's got the tissue in her hand. He's got his hat and his tie on the bed next to her. And so she goes down to collect the insurance money. And they say, look, a court ruled that this was homicide, that this was first-degree murder. This is an accidental death insurance policy. You cannot collect this. She says, okay. She goes back home. She hires a lawyer, and they sue the insurance company. And literally in the same courtroom that Caliph Washington was convicted of first-degree murder by a jury of 12 white men and a white judge, another jury and another judge is going to rule Cowboy Clark's death accidental so that she can inherit, she can receive the insurance money. And in the meantime, Caliph Washington is sitting at Kilby Prison here in Montgomery and waiting for a date with the electric chair while she collects her insurance money for an accidental death. All right. So I think, do you need me to wrap up?
I mean, if you have anything else you'd like to say,
I mean, I know I'm kind of leaving all this story undone, but I told you it was a complicated story, to tell you, I guess it's kind of trite to tell you to read the book if you want to find out what's happened, but.
we get that a lot.
Caliph will ultimately be tried 3 different times for this crime. Double jeopardy. This was not any double jeopardy. His crimes, his trials will be over. His convictions will be overturned on constitutional court error, and he can be tried again. All right, and he's going to spend the next 15 years trying to clear his name, which in reality he never does. His name is never cleared. He doesn't die in the death penalty, but he almost does, to the point that he is in the Bible room next door with his head shaved, about to be electrocuted. And one man saves his life. And this is another great irony of history. And it's George Wallace. Gives him stays of execution. Okay, I'll take some questions and try to fill in some of the gaps for you if I can.
Georgia, Ann and I have questions. If you'll raise your hand, we'll pass you the microphone.
Who were the lawyers involved in the retrials?
Caliph had a court-appointed white attorney because he needed to have a white attorney represent him in court. Now, David Hood and Orlzell Billingsley are going to work. Caliph was poor, really poor. They would, they're not going to be able to pay anybody. But out of the goodness of their hearts, Hood and Billingsley are going to work on all three of his trials. The first 2 trials was a white court-appointed attorney by the name of Kermit Edwards, who had a reputation as an ambulance chaser. And he, in the 60s, Caliph's tried in 57, he's tried again in 59, then he's not tried again until 1970. In the 57 and 59 trials, Kermit Edwards is going to represent him. And in the 1960s, Kermit Edwards will be disbarred by the Alabama Bar Association for being involved in a quickie divorce scheme in Alabama. So he was given less than 10 days to prepare a defense for Caliph, and it's really obvious what had happened. And so when Cowboy Clark comes down with that gun and it goes off, the bullet hits the side of the car and comes up at this really odd angle And so that it looks like he's being shot from below, which just doesn't make sense since Caliph is so much shorter than Clark. And the forensic evidence is there. The bullet is flattened on one side. Okay, the coroner's report said it was obvious it had ricocheted off something, but what the prosecution argued was that Caliph grabbed the gun, stepped back, and shot Clark point blank range with the gun. And to me, this is why I think this is difficult history. It's also very frustrating history in the sense that I'm no lawyer, but I can figure this out pretty easily. And his court-appointed attorney never connects those dots to make an argument in his defense that this is what happened, that this gun has discharged accidentally. Okay, so but the interesting thing is the trial in 1970. There are no white males on the jury. It's predominantly African-American women. There's one black male on the jury. It's African-American women, white women, and one black male. The judge is much more fair-minded. There are no white attorneys representing Caliph. Orzel Billingsley, David Hood's back, and a young lawyer fresh out of Yale Law School by the name of U.W. Clemon, who goes on to be Alabama's first black federal judge, was also representing him. And the remarkable thing is he's convicted again.
Yes.
Does what ultimately save him is the law by the widow stating that it was an accidental death? Does the law come in? Is that the twist and how he's able to get saved? Does that have any reference at all?
No, and that was one of the key parts of the defense in the 1970 trial was that, look, the court's already ruled this is an accidental death, okay, and but it had no bearing on this. In 1970, Caliph will receive bail for the first time, and here he is coming out of the Bessemer, Jefferson County Courthouse in Bessemer on bail. He's being greeted by Orzel Billingsley, okay, and then here he is in 1970 in the courtroom at his third trial for this, with Hood on sitting down and then Billingsley overlooking him.
You've mentioned that you have Bessemer family roots anyway. Had you ever heard anything about this case before you started your research? And where in your research did you discover that the sheriff, the one killed, had worked for your uncle? And how is that for you to realize that?
Yeah, well, there are all these really strange personal connections. I'd never heard of Caliph Washington before, okay? And Caliph and his family moved up to Bessemer from Pickens County, Alabama, in the late 30s, early 40s. My family had moved up from Pickens County, not too far from them, at the same time period to go to work for, my grandfather was a miner in U.S. Steel. He worked in Muscoda Mines, which is close to Bessemer. Caliph's dad also worked in Muscoda Mines. And so no doubt they probably worked together at some point with this. So, it was some really interesting connections. And when I started looking up Cowboy Clark, I saw that he was all it said was he worked at a gas station, and was able to start putting it together and realized through a city directory, I was like, well, he worked at the gas station that my uncle at that time managed and later owned. And, I used to go down there in the summer and wipe windshields and help him out around the gas station. And Cowboy Clark used to do odd jobs for my aunt. My aunt's still alive. She's 98. She has a photographic memory. And when I asked her about Cowboy Clark in an oral history interview, her attention to detail was absolutely phenomenal of the things. And so here's the interesting thing. She was head of nursing at Bessemer General Hospital. And when she was working the graveyard shift, when Cowboy Clark is rolled in on a stretcher during that night after he's been shot, and she vividly remembered picking up the phone and calling my uncle, GW. My uncle had no name; he just had initials. So he even has initials on his birth certificate. And she called him up and said, "GW, Cowboy Clark's laying up here dead." So the connections are really interesting. Yes, ma'am.
In your research for your book, did you ever interview any of the descendants of the major actors here, Cowboy Clark, Stud Grimes, the chief of police, the chief deputy sheriff? Where are they now?
Yeah.
And what are they doing? And if you did interview them, what were their responses?
Caliph, when you get so close to eternity and facing a date in the Big Yellow Mama, it obviously is going to change you. Caliph becomes a minister while he's in prison and begins ministering to other inmates. And so by the time we get here to the 1970 trial, his lawyers refer to him as Reverend Washington. Okay, he is by that point ordained, and he is going to die. He's in extremely ill health. You can see just looking at the photos how much weight he's gained during his prison stay. And one of his friends told me that the white man couldn't kill him, but the pork chop did, and that he had extremely high cholesterol and dies before I've started the project. But I know his widow and all of his children, and it's just an absolutely remarkable family. Ma'am?
The white descendants of the white players.
Yeah, okay. Well, Cowboy Clark's widow married about 6 or 7 times, and so I kept tracking her down. But virtually everyone that was directly associated with this was deceased by the time I started the project. So it was very difficult to kind of recreate the atmosphere, and that's why these trial transcripts were so important. Now, Stud Grimes, and this is another one of these connections. Stud Grimes had a son who was also a Bessemer police officer. His name was also Lawton Grinds. They didn't call him Stud, they called him Junior. All right? He's the person that actually took the mugshot photographs and did the fingerprinting. All right? When I graduated college, I got a job working at the Western Star newspaper in Bessemer. And the photographer there was a retired Bessemer police officer by the name of Junior Grimes. And so if you asked him a direct question, he would tell you nothing. But if you were sitting with him over lunch, he would regale you with these stories of the Bessemer police department. And so much of what I was able to recreate was from my time speaking with him and getting a real sense of how corrupt this police department is, and also the district attorney's office. Yes, sir.
Hey, so 1950s, there are a couple of local and national groups. I'm thinking like the NAACP. Did anyone outside of the 2 lawyers, did they rush to champion Caliph's cause here? Were they supported by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund? I'm thinking of these, there were there were cases in other Alabama cities that they tried to turn into sort of what they called little Scottsboroughs.
Right.
And this would be,
Yeah.
one.
Yeah,
So did he get support from the NAACP or anyone?
He didn't. He did not. And one of the reasons is it took me so long to finish this book, besides the fact that I work at a teaching institution and teaching and students come before completing research projects, Caliph is released. His second trial is overturned in 1965. Okay, he is released from prison. The judge does not enjoin Bessemer from retrying him because it's happened over a technicality, so he can be retried without double jeopardy. He walks out of Kilby Prison. Bessemer police officers are there waiting on him. Put him in the jail, put him in the squad car, take him back to Bessemer, put him in the jail cell in 1965. His third trial is in 1970. And I could not figure out why in the world it took, so much for the right to a speedy trial. Okay. And so he sits down at the Jefferson County Jail in Bessemer for 5 years awaiting this third trial. Okay. What I realized was a couple of things, finally figured this out, that a couple of things happened. One was that the district attorney was involved with the Gambino crime family in New York and was corrupt to the core. And there was no financial benefit for retrying Caliph Washington. Okay, so he just ignored it and just left him there. And then the second thing, which to me is sort of one of the great ironies in this, is that George Wallace gives Caliph 13 stays of execution in 1963 and 1964. And the great liberal icon of Birmingham, the head of the ACLU, was an attorney by the name of Chuck Morgan. And Chuck Morgan got involved in Caliph Washington's case. So I'm coming back around to answer your question with the ACLU. But what Chuck wanted to do was to use Caliph Washington's name on a federal court case to integrate Alabama's jails and prisons. Okay, the case goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that case is Washington versus Lee. The reason he wanted Caliph's name on it was because his last name was Washington, and he knew that the head of the Alabama prison system was Frank Lee, and he liked to put together these clever cases that people would remember. So to me, this is kind of bizarro world that somebody that I have no sympathy for, George Wallace, saves Caliph Washington's life. And to me, it was one of the great tragedies is the fact that Chuck Morgan he uses Caliph Washington. He uses him. He uses his name on the court case. Never does one thing to try to get him out of prison. Doesn't help with his legal defense, anything. And then I found some correspondence in Orzel Billingsley's papers where he's making jokes about it. And then this guy's just sitting down in this Bessemer jail, rotting away.
We have time for one last question.
Did your investigation include interviews with U.W. Clemming?
Yes, it did. Judge Clemmen was very helpful. This was the first criminal case that he had worked on. He grew up in Westfield, close to Fairfield and Bessemer on the western side of town. He was roughly, so in a lot of ways, Caliph Washington almost serves like an Emmett Till type figure because Emmett Till's death had such an impact, especially on African Americans that were roughly his same age. And the Caliph case was something that they were roughly the same age, and it was something that Judge Clemmen knew about, and it was part of his inspiration in terms of becoming a civil rights attorney, and ironically. He doesn't get an acquittal. Caliph is, in his life, is never acquitted of this crime. I don't know if y'all may have either read the book or seen the movie with Denzel Washington on Reuben Hurricane Carter, and the fact that these prosecutors just wouldn't give up re-prosecuting this guy. Okay, he is scheduled for a 4th trial, but it never happens. All right, and he remains under indictment the rest of his life. And about 10 days after his death, a judge by the name of Mac Parsons down in Bessemer, he's deceased now, dismissed the case 10 days after Caliph Washington died. So he remained under indictment the rest of his life.
Thank you so much to our speaker. Thank you all for coming. And the books are available in the lobby if you'd like to purchase one. Thank you.
Thank you.